Thank you very much, Isabel and Anthony Morgan, for reaching out to me, and James for writing such a incredibly compelling book and making the time to be in conversation with me. I'm really honored. So I would imagine there would be a good amount of interest in hearing you unpack the choice for the title from the lifted from the Claude McKay poem. But if you agree, I would like to get to it in a little bit more of a roundabout way. And begin with the question of the place of writing. And I've been thinking as I was reading it, we can say, in a kind of simple sense that there are lots of genres, right? There are lots of voices. Uh, Even when the writing voice is in the first person, that is split, multiplied, right? But the one thing that I am interested in is the relationship between what we might call a certain conflict of interest, which I'll explain, and the idea of interest convergence, which you explore from Derek Bell, you mentioned a few times. And the conflict of interest, I think, is about, the obligations of an academic book, right? And and so you say in the beginning, you want to, this is not the philosophy book that you probably should have written, but it's a book that you was not, nobody asked you to write, and some people asked you not to write, right? So you put it up there, like right at the beginning, right? So there is this problem with the certain demands for transparency. So the philosophy book, right, would be transparent, quote unquote, but only to a certain audience. Whereas you wrote a book philosophically, right? And so maybe you had a different audience in mind, but that does not mean that you were not also needing to negotiate how much to withhold, right? Redirect, be indirect, and how much, to share and give access to. So can you talk about where does one go? Where do you go when you have to do this kind of writing? Like,
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's kind of has some biographical elements to it, in the sense that uh, there's a history behind how this book came in this shape, that is now published. And it was initially, as I mentioned in the sort of introduction, that it started out being one kind of project that was under contract with another publisher, and it was supposed to be on a series that was relating philosophy, phenomenology, and object theory, and sort of like a new realism, a new materialism kind of study. And they wanted me to write a book on blackness or race and thing theory or objects study. And I started to write the book about a series of particular objects that I would sort of tell philosophical stories around. And as I was writing it, I was discovering that the language of philosophy and the way that we traditionally write it within the canon could not really talk about or address the things that I was trying to discuss. And a lot of it was how to navigate a kind of emotional space, in a affect theory that we call it, and we have like theories for all the things that we wanted to discuss, and then the ways that you have to discuss those theories in terms of citation, in terms of the formal style of writing, in terms of critique, and all of that fell short. And every time I went to write it, it would turn out to be a series of ideas that I was exploring. And I think what it really came down to was that I couldn't talk about Blackness in all the ways I wanted to talk about it, by telling a linear canonical story because it would only talk about Blackness, but it wouldn't talk from the perspective that I was trying to encapsulate. And so part of it was the challenge of form and structure. And part of when I do philosophy, I always say there's something that has to be a fit between what you're talking about and the form and structure that you're utilizing to talk about it. And if those two things are either divergent or in conflict, or in contradiction, then the thing that you're writing about will either fail to reveal itself, or the revelation that you're actually given will be incoherent. And so fiction, or what I call Black speculative fiction or analytic fiction, was the best way I could actually address the thing I was trying to write about. And the first contract fell through for that very reason. They wanted something that at the moment, I just couldn't do that. Um,
Mhm.
and so the thing that turned out to be what they wanted was, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, later. The footnotes are like analytic, philosophical thesis kind of writing, and they wanted the end notes to be the text and the fiction to be the end notes. And I had inverted the two, and it just didn't feel authentic to what I was actually trying to do. And so, um, I ended up having to go with another publisher, and I found Columbia, and there's a story behind that as well. And they took it as is. There were no requests for changes, which I was honestly surprised with as well. And they got what the project was immediately. So it's sort of just like happenstance, almost luck of circumstance that we, sort of found each other.
Well, as you said, I mean, I believe that's true also for publications, right? They have to find their own home, the appropriate home, to be
Mhm.
what they need to be, right? And but how do you, okay, so but Black speculative fiction is, we can say, maybe maybe you'll agree, it's a revelatory mode of
Mhm.
writing, right? But and you, especially at the end, at the epilogue, but throughout, you keep making reference to Frederick Douglass, who was a figure very, very important to you. That comes clear, as perhaps the one that initiated the genre within, is wrapped into the slave narrative, right?
Mhm.
That this kind of mode of writing, and a lot of it has to do, but it still practice a certain amount of strategic indirection, right?
Mhm.
Strategic, opacity is the name, the term that everybody uses, but just for clarity. And so how do you, so you've negotiated two very different genres, but within that, right, there is a directness about it, obviously, but I would hope that a careful reader would also perceive how much is still withheld,
Mhm.
and necessarily so, right? So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of, I won't call it cryptic, but like you were saying, there's a kind of opacity, and the opacity is inherent in the thing that is happening. And part of it is a kind of, um, you can, I like to think about it in the sense of like frequencies, and in the sense
Mhm.
of appearances, in the sense of disappearances. And the things that we're attuned to are the things that we can pick up. And the things that we're not attuned to are the things that sort of pass us by and they become excess or excessive. And I like to think about Black work in that way, that it requires a certain kind of work, a certain kind of attunement, a certain kind of capacity to pick up what is either being refused or what is simply not present, in a subjective sense, but it's present, but maybe not there, for everyone to understand. Part of it is, and this is where so much of the speculative fiction comes from, is I think about them as parallel and intersecting dimensions, and that different people functionally can exist in different dimensional spaces in which the thing might be right there in front of you, but you might not be attuned to even see that it's there. And I think a lot of what is going on in Black literature functions in that kind of way. And so there are moments that um, I'm more direct and I will give some like mythological origins or mythological stories to explain certain portions of what I'm working on. And in other parts, it's just not, it's not immediately going to be there. And I remember, and this might sort of tell the process going back 20 years. When I was in grad school, this was in, and I'm going to date myself in terms of how old I actually am. When I started grad school in the early 2000s, I didn't have a computer. And I would just write the papers out, footnotes, everything, then go to the computer lab and type them out. In the first paper, the first semester I turned in, there were, I think, only one or two footnotes. And the professor says, it's like a 25-page paper. Why aren't there any citations? And I said, they're all in there. And he says, well, what do you mean they're all in there? I said, things are in italics, things are in parentheses, and things are in quotations. And those are sort of markers that you need to know the conversation is shifting on this term. And the shift will happen when it's italicized, but there'll be some indication, some flagging. And I remember him saying to me, that's not what we do in academia. You have to cite everything that you're doing and all the moves you're making so that the reader will know. And my initial thought, because I was coming out of reading a lot of literature, was that the reader has to come to the text with a certain kind of ethic of labor, and that nothing's just going to be given to you. You have to kind of earn the text, and that you'll be given flag posts along the way. But if you don't adhere to those flag posts, or if you're not paying attention, then you just miss the text itself. And I remember that's the answer I gave. Like Ralph Ellison doesn't quote anything. I'm not citing things. And he says, well, that's what academics do. And I thought for a long time that that was shortcutting, that you are spoon feeding somebody citations because you don't want the reader to work. And that a lot of the literary figures that I was working through, and a lot of the philosophers I was working through, they didn't give any citations in terms of what they meant. And people would spend whole careers trying to figure out what exactly is Hegel talking about in this paragraph. Is it this? Is it this moment? Is it this historical moment? And we would just sit around and just pretty much guess, like it's like doing detective work. And I
Mhm.
thought about what, we're having to earn the text itself, and that ideas, when they're spoon fed to you, often aren't really understood. They're just sort of surfacely understood, like reading an encyclopedia. But a lot of Black text you just can't give to somebody. It's a process of what it is that they're bringing to the text to reveal something that you're actually displaying for them.
That is a thank you so much for that. I mean, it really kind of explains or clarifies the this idea that this book is encouraging a certain ethics of the encounter. It's an encounter. It's not something you just read and right. And so
I
and
like
and
that word.
so yeah, it kind of invites revisiting, like like someone you just met and you're like, hey, I want to continue a conversation. Can we see each other again? Like this kind of, that is inviting this. And so maybe, which is what you mentioned by labor, right? Like there needs to be a certain amount of investment, right? Certain amount of,
Mhm.
including which I think is a wonderful value to practice, the knowledge of one's ignorance, realizing, I think I missed something here, right? And it's like, okay, maybe next time, right? So the sense of that, it's not inviting mastery, which is one of the types of readings that we are taught and trained in academia, right? The mastery over the object,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Right. Um, so but in terms of obviously, so the book has a lot of moments of transport and transcendence and I'm reminding of Sarah Cervenak talking about wandering as this kind of practices of freedom that happen in the groove of one's mind, right?
Mhm.
And so, and you go, these objects, I mean, in different ways, offer the opportunity to talk about these practices of imagining freedom, right? And so I would like to hear you talk about a little bit, for me, like the operative uh, issue, the operative concept there is practice, meaning the freedom is not just imagined, you know, you have a vision, it has to be practiced. That
Mhm.
imagining freedom is work, again, that one does or does not do every day, right? And so can you, I don't know if that resonates with you, like to think about practice in this sense, and if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, so the practice of, and I like the idea of practice, because so much of how I approach just doing philosophy, I was told when I was in grad school was esoteric, but I always thought about philosophy as a kind of esoteric kind of endeavor. So going all the way back to the ancients that talked about philosophy beginning with a kind of bewilderment, with this sort of endless horizon that you're chasing. But because it's an horizon, the horizon is always going to evade. And so there's always something in excess of the things that we think that we can actually capture in language or concepts or ideas. And that there's always going to be something that is beyond that thing. And part of what I find so fascinating with this notion of Blackness is that it is very much this capacity to both at the same time know that there's something substantive in existence, but yet also what you find to be substantive is also excessive of any idea that you can put to that thing. And
Mhm.
so we think about something like what freedom looks like, there is a practical element of doing something with your freedom. So it's not just the idea that you can do, that you can be free simply because you have a concept, but that you actually can initiate that concept materially in the world as a way of organizing space and time. But that is also at the same time this kind of esoteric idea of consciousness and time and reality and all the things that we sort of know make up this thing we call the world. Um, and that freedom is at once this kind of esoteric state of reality, but is also somehow material as well. And the stories kind of mediate and kind of meander between those two kind of states. Because a lot of what I experience about the world is a kind of surreal landscape anyway. And that we've just kind of learned to simplify it, and we've kind of learned to make it coherent, but in all these other ways, it's just largely incoherent. And part of, I think, what makes Black speculative fiction so appealing is that it invites incoherency as a way of grounding itself in the world, because the world is itself incoherent. And it doesn't see this incoherence as a kind of flaw, and it doesn't see this incoherence as something that has to be stamped out. But at once you can discuss something, but also know there's something that can't be captured in that conversation. So it's this sort of ongoing kind of, I guess, ongoing kind of work that goes in. Um, and I like the what word did you use? I like, um,
What
uh,
practice of imagining
yeah, practice.
freedom?
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah, thank you.
practice.
Yeah, it's this ongoing sort of omnipresent practice that has ethical and aesthetic and existential sort of boundaries and borders and implications.
Right. So. So on that note, right? So obviously there is certain importance given to technology, right? But technology in the widest sense, right? And I think about it as it seems like the again, and in keeping with practice, it's a know-how, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
a uh, when I read Frank Moten, I'm always struck by where what he calls the knowledge of freedom pops up. But it's not a knowledge, just like you described now, it's not a knowledge, it's not the mastery over something, right? It's not that type of knowledge. It's just an intuition, maybe, right? That right, that keeps one going and practicing more and seeking more and figuring out other technologies, other know-hows, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been thinking about it, but the writing itself is one of these technologies, though. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think about two things. One is what are these know-hows, right? That you have, I mean, some of them you have discussed in this book, but also, um, like for example, when you say, the Underground Railroad is
Mm-hmm.
already a know-how, right? It's one of these technologies, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of ways of accesses, other levels of practice, other level of practicing and imagining, right? Um, and so yeah, but and within that, the writing in this book, it's always obvious that it's very much a public act, right? So there are these public figures, there are these moments of someone speaking in front of a public, and
Mm-hmm.
but they're so encroaching that it really makes you wonder when is black does blackness get not to be public, right? It's like the public is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and it's not good news, right? It's just that there is something terribly limiting and confining about the publicity of writing as a technology.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess part of what I want to say about that is thinking about what we mean by technology. Because sometimes this notion of the subject understanding itself as subject in contradistinction to an object that it has sort of alienated in order to reify so it can understand itself through its mastery of this thing called an object, um, might be a kind of technology, but it might not be a techne in the sense of a fundamental understanding. And so much of, I think so much of how we understand technological advancement, thinking about Fred Moten, technological advancement and things like the ecological footprint that we have onto the world and all the things that we sort of add to it comes to a sort of fundamental understanding of what a subject is in relationship to the objective world, and the subject being this thing that is standing outside of that world that is then reflecting onto that world. And I think part of when I read like slave narratives is I ask myself sort of fundamental questions about what technology really is and what access did they have to the technological. And I don't think about like guns and gunpowder and bullets as technology. And I don't really think about what we call technology as real technology, sort of like fighting and defeating nature as a mode of technology. Because everything we have is a manner in which we're going to enslave nature, to dominate it as a way of our technological advancement. And there's so many older cultural frameworks that don't have this as their foundation. And when we go back and we look at them, we have no concept over how they did anything that they did because they didn't have combustion engines and tanks and cranes, and they didn't have electricity the way we understand electricity. They didn't harness anything in that sense. And I wonder, and this, a lot of it comes just from this kind of intuition of Blackness itself, that there's something that's amiss with how we're doing things and how we're going about things, it makes me wonder when I go back and look at historical records, what exactly were they doing in those moments? What did they know about reality that has now just gone in either underground, it's either in fantasy or fiction, the occult, mythology, folklore, but it's somehow into the realm of the non-existent. And it's interesting because Anglo-American and European concepts in the mid 20th century tried to reenact that through surrealism by trying to get outside of consciousness into this thing called the unconscious and get back to this ancient state before we actually tried to colonize the world through this thing called technology. And the Afro-surrealists, which I think Frederick Douglass was one, were always there because they always knew because they were always outside of technology. And technology was always used as an oppressive weapon. So they never understood themselves through that technology, but always in contradistinction to evade it. And they used counter kind of measures and counter forms of techne and modes of doing and being that largely we just don't believe were true. And that's always interesting when I talk to historians and ask them questions, they just can't get their heads around these stories being true. And there has to be an explanation, and it has to be metaphorical. So if Harriet Tubman can disappear right in front of your eyes, that can't be true. That's a metaphor. And
Right.
I ask them, well, why can't that be true? Because you believe in, let's say, wireless technology, and you have no concept how that works, and you still believe it because you use your phone. And so,
Right. Right.
but
Yeah.
functionally, if people were doing this, and we have this historical record that it was being done, and there's stories about it, how do we access that? And I think that's why the speculative fiction, for me, is such an important function, because philosophy, at least the way that we understand it in terms of formal logic, that we accept as legitimate, rules out from the very beginning the possibilities of other kinds of things. And going back to your question about like freedom, there's no way for me to even imagine what freedom could look like from within the state that we're in, because it would have to look like something like European or Anglo-American modes of freedom. And those things seem to be antithetical to most life, not just Black life, but life generally. And it seems weird that that would be our goal, to be part of a colonial state or to be leaders of the colonial state. Um, and how do we rethink this notion of freedom? I think it goes back to rethinking this notion of techne.
Right, right. And thank you so much for that. When I asked the technology, I had in mind techne, right? That the technology and the writing as technology that you
Mhm.
mobilize is this other kind, right? And it's a know-how. And so I'm glad that you touched on it because I think you do a tremendous job of really asserting, I don't want to say defending because you're not defensive, but like asserting these other knowledges, right?
Mhm.
Right. And
Mhm.
it's like Harriet Tubman, well, right. And since you mentioned Arthur Jaffe's film or the Q&A between Saidiya Harman and Arthur Jaffe's film Dreams Are Colder Than Death, one of the which I happen to study with my group quite intensely, one of the
Mhm.
things that happened in that film is that he asked the various intellectual and artists, the specialists and the uncommon folks talking, what do you know? To at some point say what they know, right? And it was a question that it seems very simple, but in fact, it's exactly comes with the complications that you just described, right? That there is a knowledge, there are things that one knows and they just do, right? And it's and I see you constantly weaving, kind of coming back to this type of knowledge
Mhm. Mhm.
without, like affirming it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in a really beautiful way, which is also, hey, if you're not on board, you're not on board. But I just said it, like I'm not gonna retreat from this mode of knowledge, which is
Mhm.
also practical knowledge, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, there's and I I like this idea because it brings me back to like working in phenomenology and this notion of tactile or sort of embodied knowledge that
Mhm.
we call either like habit or something in that range where we just sort of do things without consciously being aware that we're doing them. And the way that we organize the spaces around us facilitate us to sort of function unconsciously in these kind of ways. So we can know where something is located, and not even, we can be in a room with the lights off and know where to find something because we have this kind of tactile kind of knowledge. And Fanon talks about being in a world where you're disoriented, where all the things are arranged for you. And then so that you can't have embodied knowledge about the world and everything you're doing, you have to be hyper aware and hyper conscious and hyper vigilant that you are in a body, that you are in this space. The space is not inherently designed for your existence because you didn't have a way of organizing where things were laid out or the plans of how they're laid out. And I think about all the ways in which we just take certain knowledge for granted and certain forms of knowledge just become the way the world is.
Mhm.
And because no one speaks them, even when I was in grad school, I would ask questions to the text, and it was just a taken for granted thing that was there that nobody really could explain. Well, um, why is the writer arguing for this idea? What is going on in the world around them? What is like, do we take this idea seriously? Or are we just sort of reading it for what we want to take out of the text? And a lot of it is just the unconscious elements of what we imbibe as practically true about the world. And because we've imbibed them as practically true from a cultural sense, we don't ever have to even justify their existence. And a lot of what I work on are just the things that I just take to be practically true about the world. And
Mhm.
that's why they just sort of come out matter of factly, because sometimes I don't even think that other people wouldn't agree with this because it seems to be so like obviously true to me that when I'm reading it, I just say, well, everybody thinks this, or everybody knows this, or everybody's read this text, and everybody's read this text in this way. Um, and it just so happens that even with traditional or canonical philosophical text, there are a lot of people who aren't reading the text the way that I'm reading them. I don't think they're reading deeply. I think that's the distinction, but it might just be the how what we're coming to the text with. And so much of the 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 book was sort of centered on my own intuitions. Um, and letting them be front and center. And all the things that I've thought about and all the things I read about were front and center. And because a lot of the time in academia, you're taught to retreat and hide that part of yourself so that you can be legible, so that you can be something that is judged as legitimate or scholarly, so you can go from one thing to the next, to the job, to the promotion. And I was discovering along the way that there were all these things I was just sort of like hinting at, but I never just said them. And they were sort of there in all the text, but I couldn't just directly say them. And in this book, I could not, I could not directly say them because it kept coming out. And so once I stopped trying to fight that element off, it kind of came on its own. Because I think it's a lot of it were the intuitive moves that I had been sort of navigating anyway.
And that too is a practice of freedom, right?
Mhm. Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
I mean, when you say, of course everybody knows that. I mean, there's this like this mode of acting as if a black world was the entire world,
Hmm.
right? As if. And so and it's this constant, I mean, and as if is so much part of this speculative, like it's so then the act itself becomes world making. And
Hmm.
and so it continues. Yeah. I have a question about origin.
Hmm.
Because you say, uh, the Black speculative fiction is a cosmogenesis, right? That's one of the ways in which you talk about it. I think it's in the preface. Um, and maybe this is a personal question. It's just something that I think about a lot.
Mhm.
And I think about it in this case by way of Stephen Best's book, None Like Us. And his contention is basically is that the attachment to an origin as the key to belonging in the present
Mhm.
is a problem. To the
Mhm.
extent that the origin, right, is the key to a sense of belonging in the present, it is, he doesn't say over-determining, but obviously that's kind of the idea, right? And he's
Mhm.
trying to think about modes of unattachment rather than fixation with belonging, right?
Mhm.
And so so one way of asking this is that what does it mean to imagine a future that doss not require you or
Mhm.
me, right? That's how I think of unattachment.
Mhm.
I don't know if maybe, well, ask me for clarification. So I'm trying to think of like, what is the function of origin
Mhm.
in your thinking and the way, right? Because
Mhm.
I don't perceive that the origin ends up performing the function that Stephen Best did, critiques in a sense, which is like it's the only key to. So you go back to the archive, retrieve the archive because that's the only key to belonging in the present, right?
Mhm.
I don't have the sense that it functions that way, but I do wonder about, you know, but I do think that the attachment can be a problem for anybody. That too much attachment is not necessarily, or to origin, to explanations, to yeah. So it's the
Yeah, I agree if we think of origin as an objective, concrete starting point. And usually when I'm teaching my undergrads, in any course, if it's philosophy or literature, we go back to some of the early texts of the founding of the United States as this thing we call a country. And we largely have thought about it as this geopolitical territory. And I asked the students, how do we justify geopolitical territory? And they're usually thinking in terms of slavery or in terms of institutions like an army or a government. But when we start to actually read, let's say, um, uh, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and how metaphysically spiritual that thing is, of how he just sort of conjures an origin out of nothing. So there's nothing but death everywhere around him. And he conjures from this the will of God in order to instantiate this thing called democracy on this thing called the earth. And that's the calling that's going to transform this thing called a colony into this thing called a nation, which is not just a political institution, but a spiritual union. And that is so much the idea of origin as a metaphysical postulation, um,
Mhm.
and not one of a past where we can go back and dig in an archive and say, well, there it is. And even something like Joseph Winthrop's City Upon a Hill. And we think of like the origins from like the 1600s into the end of the Civil War and how the nation just sort of made itself up out of nowhere. And I don't think, because sometimes the students will say it's just revisionist history of justifying, but I also think that there's something metaphysical about grounding yourself in the past, about why something like familial ties is so important. Because it's not just we're looking at DNA and figuring out who we are in some genetic sense, but there's a narrative that we can construct. And genetics is just one way of constructing it, but there's also family trees, there's also lineage, but lineage is largely selected because we don't select everyone in our lineage. We select a certain group of people, and then we tell a story through that. And so much of what we do is speculative fiction, and we think it's material, but how we understand materiality is itself a speculation. And so for me, when I think about Frederick Douglass telling multiple conflicting origin stories about who he is, who his father is, his mother, and some of the stories are just on the face of them so extreme and absurd that I don't think he's trying to actually say it's true. Like my mother walked all these miles every single night just to give me a kiss and then she went back. Like, well, that probably didn't happen. But what is he actually telling us about the origins of his own sort of sense of identity and his own value? Well, here's a narrative. And I think so much of what I was trying to think about in this book with Black speculative fiction is that everyone sort of creates a narrative about their own existence, but it's just largely Black people that get put on the label of not having an origin because you don't know where you came from in this particular land. You can't have an origin when most Europeans made up their origin. They would just come here and just say, "Here I am now." We're not going to speak this language from Italy. We're not going to have the Italian last name. We're going to be whatever we are at this moment and go forward with that idea. And then 2 generations later, we can go back to Italy. But in this 2 generations, these kids aren't speaking Italian. They don't cook the food. They don't know the culture and the language. They're Anglo-American Christians. And so I think a lot of times we put that weight on material fact on Black people and say, well, if you don't have this material fact, that means you're lost in the world, as opposed to saying, well, we're creating this thing together as we're constructing this thing called America, this thing called Blackness, this thing called whiteness. And we are constructing our own origins. And I think Douglass was so explicit with that idea that he's going to just straightforwardly make up a story. And I think Heroic Slave was just like when I read it the first time, I said that he's writing this right at the end of the right at the beginning of the Fugitive Slave Act, and he's just saying, "I'm just gonna start making stuff up," and it's completely unverifiable because I'm going to use a character who's historical as a figure, but no one knows anything about him, so you can't verify a thing about what I'm saying. And that was like that's his foundation for freedom, for Black freedom. It's in this character that's completely unverifiable. And I often thought about that because people would ask me, so where are you from in this kind of way? As if that was the determinative thing when they themselves couldn't really, in a real way, speak about their own lineage. So I think it's like a metaphysical postulation that Blackness is itself empty. And when I investigate it and interrogate it, I find nothing but fullness there. It's like a plenum as opposed to an absence.
Right. Right. It's not it if I read you correctly, it doesn't interpret origin as an arche, right?
Mhm,
With the
mhm,
same
mhm.
principles. But origin is a maybe a projected space of belonging that precedes
Mhm.
you, will continue, right? But it
Absolutely.
doesn't stop at you. Doesn't stop at you. Um, Isabel is back.
I'm back. I'm back to inaugurate our Q&A, but this has been a really wonderful conversation so far. So thank you for it. We just have one question in the Q&A from the audience. So to our audience members, I would encourage you to ask some other ones while we're discussing this first one. But Brooke Maddox writes that just before tuning in for this webinar, I was listening to the director of the Freedom Theater in Jenin camp in Palestine chanting, "No freedom without knowledge, no peace without freedom." Your remarks on the nature of knowledge seem so pertinent here. So this is a kind of prompt to perhaps get you to say something, and I would invite both of you to say something about the relationship between freedom, knowledge, and peace.
Mm. Yeah, that is, especially in this context, a really interesting question because one of the things that is sort of going through the sort of undercurrent of the text is asking about what the nation is, what a people are, whether or not nations themselves, because the idea is that the nation is supposed to exist so that individual liberties are protected. And now nations themselves become protected entities. And it's this really interesting moment where you can violate individual liberty in protection of a thing called a nation. And as and maybe I'm speaking for myself, but as a Black person, I think about, well, what do we mean when we talk about a country, a nation, a territory, a people, and how are all these things sort of interrelated? And it seems that nation states are captors of individuals by way of bodies. And now sounding Foucauldian, captured populations, those kind of things. And that's they've now become the individual subjects of the world. Something that we talk about a lot in class with immigration, whether or not nation states are themselves the problem. So it's definitely one of those things of asking that question.
Yeah. And also I would just I completely second for me just I would just come back to the question of, what is the knowledge of freedom? And it's its own type of knowledge that it doesn't even it's not a type of knowledge that necessarily has a content, right? We're right, and James's book is very clear about freedom, right? That we can't give it a really clearly defined content, right? But it's still a knowing, right? That this doesn't have to be it, right? That this is not like, yeah, that this reality with the nation state, with the does not have to be the end of the story. It's the sense of something more.
Hmm.
Thanks so much for that. I have a question, but I also want to give Alessandra a chance to ask another question if you would like.
Let me see. No, we touched on most things. Yeah, because he kind of touched on a bunch of stuff that I had a separate question, but he
Okay.
addressed it. So please.
So I guess, I mean, it's a question I'll try to direct to the both of you. It hopefully dovetails a little bit with where you left off on the kind of metaphysical aspect of origins. But I'm curious about how maybe in both of your work, the questions around temporality, and the way that past, present, and future are intertwined, is a kind of central part of what you're up to. So are there other things that you would want to say about how you bring these, temporal moments together, or how, or even how in a single moment you want to open up multiple temporalities or ways of thinking about them? And yeah, and then I invite you to talk more about the metaphysical components or epistemological ones. But yeah, this seems central to what you're up to, and so I just wanted to kind of invite more conversation about it.
James?
So it's interesting that you asked that. I think I guess apropos, because the work that I'm working on now is on Black time travel, and rethinking what time travel really means. Because in the Anglo-American sense, it means, going back or forward in the temporal framework, but yet remaining in the physical space, just that space in the future. And a lot of time when you're thinking about Blackness, it's existing in all of these multiple temporal spaces in which it's both past, present, and future simultaneously. So it might be trapped in the past metaphysically in terms of how we think about people, but is existing in the current moment, even in the technological sense of enslavement, where the body becomes the tool. But it's also projected into the future about what it means to be free, what it means to be a subject, what it means to have all these things. And so when I think about Black people, I think about them as this kind of trans-temporal space in which there's always this kind of element of time travel just within the individual. And I think about just like my own grandfather, and because like it's always a weird story that I tell. That's his family were sharecroppers, which is largely sort of the extension of slavery. And his sisters go off to school to become school teachers. One of them comes back, doesn't finish college, and one day, the story he tells, I wasn't there, so I can't verify all the subjective elements, but he just one day was working and just put down the tools and just left and just walked to the next city, hitchhiked, went to the next town, and slept in the kitchen, and then worked his way through college. And then he hitchhikes his way all the way to Boston and becomes, he gets his EDD, and then he comes back and becomes president of the small college that he was, sleeping in the kitchen with. And we're talking about the span of like 30 years, 40 years, going from sharecropping to being president of a small Black college. And thinking about, for me, the span of what that progress, or the span of what that arc looks like over one lifetime. We're talking about, for me, looking at like history, these are hundreds of years that spans in just one lifetime. And like, what would temporality mean under those conditions? Because at any one particular time, if he stopped, he would be both past, present, and future simultaneously. And I would ask him questions without knowing what he was doing, but trying to figure out, what does this mean? And when, because he ended up being a preacher, because everyone was a preacher back then. All the things you're talking about, what do they really mean? Because he was nonviolent, all those kind of things. But then I would also find shotguns in the house, and no one would explain to me why the shotguns were there. They would just say, just don't touch them. Like you didn't see that shotgun. Like, yeah, but you're a preacher and now you're doing your sermons and there's a shotgun in the corner. How we explain this? And just give them butterscotch candy and tell them go away. But just thinking about like what that sense of time looks like, and when it's in a Black body, how it just sort of distorts all notions of linear time.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I'll try to be brief. I'm finding it in the filmmakers and visual artists that I work on, right? That and as filmmakers, they're really producing a new language, because and therefore they demand a new critical language, because we are still, even as a film studies as a discipline, we have fairly structured ways of thinking and understanding and approaching time. And so one of the things that come through to me is that the sense that Blackness is always there all the time, which, James, you have similar formulation in the book, right? It's always all there, right? And so what does it take to see it? And what kind of analytical language can we use to bring it out, to really give it justice, the fact that it's always there all the time? So those are kind of that's the way I approach it.